In 2009, 12 kids disappeared during a school trip to Bear Ridge National Park, leaving behind nothing but empty backpacks and a single bloody handprint. No crash, no bodies, no answers. The disappearance was initially brushed off as an unfortunate accident, but the details quickly made it one of the most chilling mysteries in the history of Brookwood. The children, aged 8 to 15, were part of an annual trip organized by the local school, a routine event that had never raised any alarms before. But on this trip, something went horribly wrong. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of the children was found. The official story claimed a tragic accident, but as weeks turned into months, more unsettling details emerged. There was no sign of a crash, no vehicle wreckage, no footprints leading away from the park, just the eerie silence of the vast wilderness and the unanswered questions left behind. Years passed, but the case never quite disappeared. Clare Thompson, a 32-year-old investigative journalist, was still haunted by the memories of that day. Her younger sister, Emily, was one of the missing children. Over the years, Clare tried to move on, but the story never let her go. She had questions, too many questions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were still out there, hidden somewhere. It wasn't until 15 years later that a discovery would be made, a discovery that would change everything. A long-forgotten journal was uncovered, with disturbing entries written in a hurry. But that was just the beginning. Clare's search for the truth would uncover secrets that went far deeper than she could have ever imagined. Clare Thompson had always been drawn to stories, the untold stories, the ones that others had left behind. It was no surprise that she became an investigative journalist. But this case was different. It wasn't just a story to her. It was personal. Emily, her younger sister, had been one of the 12 children who disappeared during the school trip to Bear Ridge National Park in 2009. Despite the years that had passed, the pain still haunted Clare. Her family never got closure, and the town of Brookwood quickly moved on. The story buried beneath a mountain of unanswered questions and lingering fear. Clare had been only 17 at the time, too young to truly understand the weight of what was happening. She'd been just a kid herself, but she knew that something wasn't right. She had attended school with some of the missing children and had spent months wondering why the case was being treated like a freak accident. Over the years, Clare's grief transformed into a relentless desire for answers. She became obsessed with the idea that the truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. After years of reporting on crimes, scandals, and injustice, Clare had finally found herself in a position where she could pursue the one story that had consumed her thoughts for over a decade. The disappearance was no longer just a chapter in the past. It was her unfinished business. She could no longer avoid the ghosts of her past, the mystery that had defined her childhood. Her role as an investigative journalist had equipped her with the tools to uncover the truth, but it also made her more aware than ever that truths, the darkest ones, were often buried deep. The catalyst for her renewed pursuit of the case came in the form of a small, dusty journal found in a local thrift store. A journal that had once belonged to one of the missing children. The pages were worn, some faded, others marked with blood stains, and one entry in particular stopped Clare cold. "I see them watching us. They won't let us leave." The cryptic words were the first real clue that something much more sinister than an accident had taken place. Clare couldn't ignore the chilling realization that Emily's disappearance, and the other children's, might have been part of a much darker conspiracy than she had ever dared to imagine. The disappearance of the 12 children on the school trip in 2009 had always been a mystery that didn't sit right with Clare. It was a classic case of a missing person story, the kind of thing that the media would sensationalize for a while before it faded into the background. But for Clare, it was more than just an isolated tragedy. It was a case shrouded in unanswered questions. There had been no crash, no wreckage, no bodies found. It was like the kids had vanished into thin air. The school trip had been a routine event for the local elementary school. Every year, a group of students would head to Bear Ridge National Park, a remote but scenic area known for its hiking trails and sprawling views. The students had been excited, eager to spend a few days in the woods, enjoying nature and bonding with their classmates. It was meant to be a simple, fun trip, one that would build memories of childhood adventure. But the reality of that day was far different. As the hours passed without a word from the children or the chaperones, concern began to mount. By evening, the search teams had been deployed, the local police were called, and volunteers from the community rallied to comb the vast expanse of the park. But when they reached the last known location of the children, the point where they had last been seen, there was nothing. No sign of a struggle, no sign of the kids. Just their backpacks and a single bloody handprint smeared across a tree trunk, leading into the dark woods. The authorities initially assumed it was a case of kids wandering off. Perhaps some of them had gotten lost, others might have been injured. The search continued, but after days of scouring the area with helicopters and ground teams, no more evidence turned up. And despite rumors of strange sights in the forest, mysterious figures seen moving through the trees, nothing official could be confirmed. The investigation was declared a failed search, with no leads, and the case soon cooled down. However, Claire never bought the official story. She was never convinced that the kids simply wandered off and got lost. There had to be more to it. There had to be a reason for the handprint, for the silence that had followed. But over time, life went on. The town of Brookwood buried the incident under a blanket of time, and the families of the missing kids were left to mourn in private, their grief muted by the lack of closure. But in the years that followed, Claire's suspicion only grew. What if it wasn't a random disappearance? What if there was something more deliberate behind the kids vanishing? And why had the town's officials acted so quickly to close the case? Were they hiding something? Claire's questions would finally lead her to an old journal she found in a dusty thrift store, left there as if forgotten by time. The journal, belonging to one of the missing children, was the first real clue that this case was much deeper than it appeared. Its faded pages hinted at strange happenings on the trip, things that hadn't been reported or acknowledged in the investigation. Claire couldn't ignore the words, the cryptic phrases written hastily in the child's journal, and what they implied about the dark forces at work. Claire knew the journal was a breakthrough, a small, seemingly insignificant clue in the grand scheme of the investigation, but it was something she couldn't ignore. The pages of the journal were worn, some stained with what looked like dirt and blood, and the handwriting was rushed, as if the author was desperately trying to get something off their chest before it was too late. The first few pages were filled with normal school thoughts, about friends, favorite books, and upcoming field trips. But then, about halfway through, the tone changed drastically. The entries started becoming disjointed, filled with vague descriptions of unsettling occurrences. One entry stood out to Claire. "They won't let us leave. The woods. Something is wrong. I can feel them watching us. The trees, they're moving." The handwriting became more erratic. The words spaced out as if the child was struggling to keep their thoughts clear. The last entry was particularly chilling. "I don't think we're going to make it out of here. The others are gone. I don't know where they went. Help us." It was signed with a name Claire recognized, Janie Myers, one of the missing children. This discovery had Claire's heart racing. The journal was a direct link to the kid's disappearance, and yet it raised even more questions. What did it mean that the child had written about the trees moving? Why had this been hidden for so long? Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an accident. Something far more sinister was involved, and it was time to investigate. She immediately contacted Ray Alvarez, a former park ranger who had been on the search teams that had scoured Bear Ridge. Ray had retired years ago, but he was still known as the local expert on the park and its secrets. Claire hoped he might have some insight into the oddities she had uncovered. Ray met her at a small cafe in the town square. His face was lined with age, but his eyes still had that sharp, calculating look. Over coffee, Claire shared her findings with him. The journal, the strange entries, and her growing belief that there was something deeply wrong with the official story. Ray listened intently, nodding along. "You're right, Claire," he said, setting his coffee cup down. "There's a lot more to this than anyone realized." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "There were rumors back then, you know, things that didn't add up." Ray paused, his eyes scanning the cafe, as though he was afraid someone might be listening. Claire could sense he was holding something back. After a moment, he continued. "I remember hearing whispers about Bear Ridge, about a hidden part of the park that was off limits to the public. The rangers were told to avoid it, but no one knew why." Claire's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning forward. Ray hesitated, but then shrugged. "I don't know for sure, but there were signs, old warnings, even symbols on trees. Some of the park's older maps had areas marked in red, places we weren't supposed to go, but no one talked about it. It was like a secret the town wanted to forget." This was the first time anyone had mentioned the hidden parts of Bear Ridge. Claire's mind was racing. She asked Ray if he could help her access some of the old park maps and files from that time. Reluctantly, Ray agreed to meet her the next day at the local library, where old records were kept. That night, as Claire reviewed the journal once more, she noticed something. A small symbol was drawn on the last page, right next to Janie's name. A strange, spiraling shape that Claire recognized from the old maps Ray had mentioned. It was identical to the symbol she had seen in the journal entries. It was no coincidence. Claire's pulse quickened. She had found the first real piece of evidence that connected the disappearance to something far bigger than just a tragic accident. The mystery was no longer about the missing children. It was about why they were taken in the first place, and who had hidden the truth. The investigation was just beginning. Claire knew it wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't turn back now. The answers were out there, buried in the heart of Bear Ridge, waiting to be uncovered. But with every step she took, Claire felt the weight of danger closing in. The next morning, Claire met Ray at the local library, where old archives and maps were kept in dusty, forgotten corners. She had brought with her the journal and the now faintly familiar symbol, hoping to find some connection between it and the hidden parts of Bear Ridge that Ray had mentioned. She felt like she was finally scratching the surface of a mystery that had haunted her for years. As she entered the library, Ray was already at a long wooden table, spread with old park maps and official documents. "I dug through the archives and found some of the old records from 2009, Ray said, pushing a pile of yellowing papers toward Claire. "These should have everything from the park's mapping of the area to search records. I didn't find much back then, but maybe you'll see something I missed." Claire sat down, her hands trembling as she began sifting through the papers. The old maps, some faded beyond recognition, showed every corner of the park, except for one area. She found it marked in red ink, an area labeled as restricted zone, a place where no one had been allowed to go, even park rangers. "What is this?" Claire asked, pointing to the restricted zone on the map. Ray hesitated before answering. "That's the area we were told to avoid. It's like a dead zone in the park. No one knows why it's off limits. I've heard rumors, but nothing solid." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She quickly compared the symbol in Janie's journal with the marking on the map. It matched perfectly. The spiraling shape was the same. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Ray, this is it," Claire said, her voice shaking. "The symbol, it's from here, from this restricted area. It's not just a random pattern. It's a marker for this spot. They were trying to keep something hidden in there, something connected to the kids' disappearance." Ray frowned, glancing at the map. But no one ever talked about it publicly. The authorities just shut it down after the kids disappeared, and the park never went back there. The whole area was treated like it never existed. Claire stared at the map, now feeling the weight of the mystery pushing down on her chest. She couldn't ignore the significance of the symbol. If it had been drawn by Janie, it meant that she had somehow known about the area, even before her disappearance. The more Claire thought about it, the more it seemed like the children had been led to the site for a reason. "What's buried in that area, Ray?" Claire asked, her voice low. Ray shook his head. "I don't know, but there's something strange about the whole thing." Determined, Claire decided they would go to the site. But first, she needed to confirm if the area had been completely off limits for a reason, or if the investigation was simply ignored. They started digging through more old records, reviewing the official statements from the search teams. After a few hours, Claire found a strange report buried within a stack of papers. An officer's notes from the night of the disappearance. It didn't make sense. The officer wrote, "At approximately 3 a.m., a strange light was spotted in the eastern section of Bear Ridge. It was too far off for a rescue team to reach, and when the search was conducted, no one reported seeing any evidence of what caused the light." Claire's blood ran cold. A strange light? What was that? She glanced at Ray, who looked just as disturbed as she felt. "You think it was connected?" Ray asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. Claire didn't answer right away. She looked at the document again, and then back at the map. The restricted zone was located in the exact area where the strange light had been spotted. It was no coincidence. "We need to see it for ourselves," Claire said, her voice firm. Ray hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "All right, but we need to be careful. This isn't just a school trip gone wrong anymore. We're looking at something much bigger, and we don't know what we're walking into." Claire nodded, already feeling the weight of the decision. They would head to Bear Ridge the next morning. Claire knew the stakes were higher than ever, but she was determined. This was no longer just about her sister. It was about finding the truth. And the truth was buried deep in the heart of Bear Ridge, behind a wall of secrets that had been hidden for too long. As Claire looked out of the library window, she couldn't help but feel that the walls were closing in. The mystery was deeper than she had ever imagined. But the more she uncovered, the more she knew she was getting closer to a truth that would change everything. The sun was setting as Claire and Ray arrived at the edge of Bear Ridge, the air thick with tension. The journey had been long, but the closer they got to the restricted zone, the more Claire's heart raced. The roads grew narrower, the trees denser, and the atmosphere felt heavier, like the forest itself was keeping secrets. They parked just outside the area marked on the map, where the trees began to grow so close together that it was almost impossible to see beyond the immediate trail. Claire glanced at Ray. His face was tense, his hands gripping the steering wheel, but he didn't say a word. They both knew that whatever they were about to find, it would be dangerous. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was something far worse. "We need to stay focused, Claire," Ray said quietly as they got out of the truck, breaking the silence. "Whatever happened here, it's not just about the kids anymore. It's bigger. We might be digging into something people don't want found." Claire nodded, her heart pounded, and a small voice in the back of her mind told her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to know. It was too late to back down now. The truth was out there, and she wasn't going to stop until it was uncovered. They grabbed their gear and made their way into the woods, following the old map and the worn trail that led deeper into the forbidden zone. The trees were thick, the air damp, and the silence was almost deafening. Ray kept a watchful eye, glancing over his shoulder every few minutes as they ventured further. The deeper they went, the more the feeling of unease grew. The air seemed to hum with something unseen, an almost unnatural presence that made Claire's skin crawl. Then, after what felt like hours, they came to a clearing, a vast open space surrounded by high cliffs. It looked like an ancient campsite, but there were no signs of wildlife, no birds, no animals, just the eerie silence of a place forgotten by time. In the center of the clearing, a rusted steel door was embedded in the ground. It was partially hidden under a thick layer of moss and vines, but the old, faded logo on it was still visible. "What the hell is this?" Ray whispered, stepping forward. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The symbol on the door matched the one from the children's journal, the same spiraling shape. She had seen it multiple times in the old records and maps. It was unmistakable now. This was the heart of the mystery. "We need to open this," Claire said, moving toward the door. She had to know what was behind it. Everything was leading here. Ray hesitated, but Claire had already pulled away the moss and vines, revealing the heavy steel handle. As she reached for it, something stopped her. A low hum echoed through the air, reverberating in the ground beneath her feet. Her eyes widened as she looked at Ray, who had frozen in place. He nodded slowly, as if confirming that they weren't alone. "We've been found, Claire," Ray said, his voice low but urgent. "This is bad. We're not the first to find this place." Claire turned back to the door and pulled with all her strength. The door creaked loudly, then slowly opened, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. They descended carefully, the air growing colder and more stale as they moved deeper into the underground facility. The faint glow of a flickering light became visible as they reached the bottom of the stairs. The walls were lined with computers, old files, and strange machinery. The deeper they ventured, the more chilling the atmosphere became. It was clear that this place had not been visited in years, but everything was still in working order. "This wasn't just some environmental research project," Claire muttered as she observed the equipment. The walls were adorned with scientific charts and notes. A series of photos pinned to the walls caught her eye. Photos of the missing children, their faces lined up in rows. But they were not just missing. These kids had been examined, their names written on the back of each photo with a date, the day they disappeared. "What the hell were they doing here?" Claire whispered, staring at the photos. Ray moved closer to one of the old machines, examining it closely. He turned back to Claire, his face pale. "This isn't good, Claire. This looks like some kind of experiment." He didn't say anything more, but his expression told her everything she needed to know. The mystery was no longer just about missing kids. It was about a dark experiment, something far more dangerous, and Claire had just walked into its heart. Claire's heart raced as she stood in the dimly lit underground facility, the full gravity of the situation beginning to sink in. What they had discovered, the hidden lab, the old records, the photographs of the missing children, was more than a discovery. It was a confession. The children hadn't just disappeared. They had been taken, examined, and used for something far more sinister. Ray stood beside her, his face pale. The machines that lined the wall seemed to hum with an eerie life of their own. Their purpose still unclear, but their implication undeniable. Claire's mind raced with the horrible realization that what they had stumbled upon was more than just an abandoned research facility. It was a place of experimentation, where children had been manipulated for unknown purposes. And all the while, the people of Brookwood had turned a blind eye. "We need to get out of here," Ray whispered urgently, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The hair on the back of Claire's neck stood up, a deep sense of unease flooding her body. Someone else was here. Someone who didn't want them to find the truth. Claire ignored him. She couldn't leave now. Not when they were so close. "Ray, look at these files," she said, her voice tight. She picked up a folder labeled Project Evergreen, the name scrawled hastily across the top. As she flipped it open, her breath caught in her throat. The pages inside were filled with research notes, detailing the children's movements, the experiments performed on them, and most shockingly, The results. It was clear now. These kids hadn't just been taken. They were part of a sick experiment designed to unlock something unnatural. What is this? Ray whispered, staring over her shoulder at the documents. He shook his head in disbelief, trying to process the implications. But Claire could barely make sense of it. Genetic testing, behavioral manipulation, psychological experiments. The children had been lab rats, nothing more than test subjects for a twisted scientific agenda. And the worst part was the names on the list. Names Claire recognized: Janie Myers, Emily Thompson, and several others who had disappeared. "There's more," Claire murmured, flipping through the pages. "This wasn't just in Bear Ridge. It's part of something much bigger. This is going on elsewhere." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, snapping both Claire and Ray out of their shock. Footsteps that weren't theirs. Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Ray, we're not alone," she hissed, her voice frantic. She quickly shoved the files back into their folder and pulled Ray toward a shadowed corner of the facility. "We need to hide. Now." They crouched behind a large stack of crates, their breaths shallow and rapid. The footsteps grew louder, and Claire's eyes darted nervously, trying to figure out a way out. From their hiding place, they saw two figures, men in black suits, walking down the corridor, speaking in low tones. They didn't seem to be looking for anything in particular, but Claire could feel their presence, a sense of danger that made her stomach turn. "We have to get out of here," Ray whispered again, his voice trembling. Claire nodded in agreement. They couldn't risk being caught, not when they were so close to the truth. But before they could move, one of the men stopped, his gaze sweeping the room, as if sensing something was off. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The man turned and began walking in their direction. "No," Claire thought. She grabbed Ray's arm, pulling him back into the shadows as silently as possible. But it was too late. The man had already spotted them. "What do we have here?" the man called out, his voice echoing through the narrow hallway. Claire's pulse spiked. "We've been found," Ray said, fear evident in his voice. Claire's mind raced. There was no way out, not without a confrontation. They had come this far, and she couldn't leave without answers. She glanced around quickly, trying to find anything they could use. Before she could make a decision, the men moved toward them, their steps quickening. Claire could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment closing in on them. But then a sudden blinding flash lit up the hallway. A loud crash, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "What the hell is going on?" one of the men shouted. Claire didn't wait for them to recover. She grabbed Ray's arm, pulling him in the opposite direction, toward a narrow exit she had spotted earlier. They ran, their footsteps pounding against the cold concrete floor, their hearts racing. Behind them, they could hear the men yelling, but Claire didn't dare look back. She had to keep moving. They had to escape with the truth. The facility was falling apart around them, and the danger was closing in. She had never felt so alive, so terrified. But there was one thing that kept her going: the knowledge that they had uncovered something horrific, something that could change everything. They burst out of the facility and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Claire's mind was still reeling from the discovery, but one thing was clear: they couldn't go back to town. They couldn't trust anyone anymore. As they fled into the wilderness, Claire knew that they had just uncovered the tip of the iceberg. The truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined, and now it was only a matter of time before someone would try to silence them. Claire stood at the edge of Bear Ridge, looking out over the sprawling forest that had been the backdrop to so much suffering. Her heart was heavy, her mind still processing everything she had uncovered. The facility, the experiments, the children, everything had led to this moment. She and Ray had come close to the truth, but the consequences of their discovery were more than either of them had expected. They had exposed the dark heart of the town, But in doing so, they had uncovered more than just a cover-up. What they had learned went far beyond the disappearance of 12 innocent kids. It was a systematic conspiracy, one that reached into the highest echelons of power, with people willing to do anything to keep the truth hidden. Clare couldn't even begin to comprehend the scope of what they had exposed. And now, she had to ask herself, was it worth it? Ray stood beside her, his face grim. "What now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Clare didn't answer right away. She thought about the danger they had faced, the people who would stop at nothing to silence the truth. The town of Brookwood had its secrets, secrets that had been buried for far too long. The question now was whether those secrets would remain hidden, or if they could finally be brought to light. The authorities would have to be informed. The truth needed to be shared with the world, but Clare knew it wouldn't be easy. Those in power would fight to protect their interests, and it was likely that Clare's life would never be the same again. But one thing was clear: the truth couldn't stay buried anymore. No matter the cost, the families of the missing children deserved to know what had really happened to their loved ones. "We have to keep going, Clare," Ray said, his voice firm. "We've come too far to turn back now." Clare nodded, feeling a surge of determination. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose. They had uncovered the dark secrets hidden beneath Bear Ridge, and the world needed to hear the truth, no matter what it would cost. As they left the forest behind, Clare knew that the fight for justice was only just beginning. But this time, she wasn't afraid. The truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it was buried. If you were as shocked as we were by the truth behind the disappearance of those 12 children, don't forget to subscribe for more investigations into hidden mysteries and dark secrets. Like this video if you believe the truth should never be buried, and comment below with your thoughts on the case. Do you think the truth will ever come to light? We want to hear your opinions. And make sure to turn on notifications, because the fight for justice is far from over. Join us as we uncover more shocking truths in the future.